All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Danielle Schwertner. As Robin said, I just graduated with a PhD from the School of Modern Languages and Cultures in Text and Image Studies in December. So having that doctor before my name is still quite new to me. I was also an international student from the States, in case you couldn't tell. And in case you couldn't tell again, I'm a bit of a Star Wars fan. So I wanted to use some pictures and memes from the franchise to lighten the mood a bit because the Viva is a heavy topic and I don't want people to get lost in that. For those of you who know anything about Star Wars, I like to imagine that all of you watching are still in the idealistic Luke from the original trilogy stage of your PhD and not yet in the grumpy, trodden down Luke from the sequel trilogy stage. Resist it as long as you can, it'll be fine. Like I said, I know that many of you here are somewhat new, if not brand new to the PhD, and your Viva likely feels very far away and like something you don't want to even think about. Or on the other hand, some of you like to be extra prepared, so it's all you can think about, even if it's still years away. Trust me, I can relate to both of those feelings. What I'm hoping to cover with this short presentation today isn't so much what to expect during your Viva, but how to change the idealization and perfectionism that surrounds our discussions of and thoughts about it, even as early in the PhD process as where you all are right now. And it's my ultimate hope that the more we talk about realistic, sometimes not so pretty Viva experiences, the less pressure we see PhDs put on themselves to have the perfect outcome. Now, what do I mean by idealization of the Viva? Well, I'm partially talking about the social media expectations of the Viva. Those of you who are on social media, especially Twitter, I refuse to call it X, so sorry, will undoubtedly have seen posts by recently Viva PhDs with wording akin to, quote, "I'm so happy to say that I passed my Viva with no/minor corrections. It was a wonderful experience and I'm so grateful to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." But have you noticed that no one ever posts specifics when they passed with more than minor corrections? For example, if I had made a post like this, it would have read something like, "I'm so happy to say that I passed my Viva with substantial corrections. I have to work on it for another 6 months and write an entirely new introduction. Yay." Doesn't really have the same ring to it, does it? Before I move on, I want to add that yes, that was actually what part of my corrections were, but more on that later. My point here is that social media, in part, has somewhat caused us to view Viva outcomes on a kind of graded basis that lends itself towards perfectionism. No corrections is suddenly seen as the epitome of Viva success, an A, if you will. Minor corrections becomes akin to a low A or high B, and substantial corrections, that's a C, maybe even a D. And it's easy to see why we start to associate it that way. Even without social media, if you're getting a PhD, chances are that at one point you were obsessed with your grades. For example, I cried on the floor of a dirty locker room the first time I ever got a C. For some of us, we've been trained to view our worth through our grades, so we add that onto things that don't even have tiered grades, like the Viva. And when you combine that with social media expectations and how pretty it looks to say that you got no corrections, again, it's easy to see how we got here. But the thing is, your diploma isn't going to say whether you got no corrections or substantial corrections. It's just going to be proof that you passed. We stress ourselves out so much about how many corrections we might get compared to our friends or to some stranger on the internet because we want some sort of proof that we're good at what we do or that we deserve to be here in the first place, that we didn't waste the last few years of our life being anything less than exceptional. And I think a large part of changing this viewpoint comes down to reframing what we view corrections to be in the first place and how we view them in the context of our individual PhD experiences. So what are corrections anyway? Because I've mostly moved past my initial embarrassment of my outcome, here's a sample of mine. The first is part of what my examiners listed as substantial corrections, and the second is one of their minor corrections. Before I get into these, I want to take a brief moment to explain my Viva experience. It can kind of be summed up by this picture of Mace Windu and Anakin Skywalker, where Anakin is told he doesn't get to become a master yet. I felt similarly to Anakin here, but let me explain in more detail. My Viva lasted the full 2 hours. I cried in front of my examiners because we were discussing an emotional part of my research and I was so pent up from stress already. And then I received substantial corrections to be completed in no more than 6 months. I went out and had a beer with my friends, went to a nice dinner with my partner, and then got home and cried for an hour because I felt like a failure. It took me a long time to not feel that way. And part of what helped me get out of that funk was changing my perspective of the corrections the examiners gave me. So let's take a look at that. Quote, "The formulation of a brief introduction to replace the current introduction." That's right, I had to write a brand new introduction and make my previous introduction chapter 1 instead. Listen, I hate writing introductions, so this was one of the worst corrections they could have given me, but it was desperately, desperately needed exactly because of that reason. Over the course of my PhD, my supervisors became very familiar with what the bulk of my thesis was about, and of course, I knew it back and front after so many years of working on it. This all made writing and editing an introduction that concisely difficult. And I couldn't really have my friends read it because while they would be approaching it with new eyes, they wouldn't have the base knowledge I needed them to have to give me constructive criticism. But my examiners did. I was very fortunate that both my internal and my external examiners were experts at different aspects of my thesis, but had not been working with me on this project for 4 years. All of their comments about how to more properly introduce my project were fresh because of that and truly genuinely made my thesis better. Because the truth is, when I submitted my thesis, I was proud of myself for finishing it, but I wasn't necessarily proud of it. A lot of things go into that. The stress of the last 1 to 2 years of a PhD in general, the stress of having to work on this during lockdown and not having access to resources, the stress of being an immigrant in this country and everything that comes along with that, having to work multiple jobs just to keep my head above water, all of that combined to me reaching a point where the thesis I submitted was the best I could do with what I had at that moment in time. I had nothing left to give without any other type of support or advice. And that's what I mean by keeping your individual experiences during your PhD in mind. The hard truth that people don't like to talk about is that it's likely some of you will have a harder, more difficult experience than some of your peers. Likewise, someone else might have it harder than you or harder for a different reason. So you owe it both to yourself and to those other PhDs to reframe the way you approach and react to Viva outcomes. In my case, my Viva went the way I expected it to, minus the crying. I don't think anyone ever expects that, but it didn't go the way I hoped it would. I knew I would get substantial corrections, but I hoped I would only get minor. I knew they would have a lot of criticism from me, but I'd hoped they'd tell me it was actually one of the best things they'd ever read. It's natural to think that way. And I know that in the coming years, many of you might look up articles, essays, threads on Twitter from former PhDs who got no corrections or minor corrections, trying to tell you how they followed a formula that helped them get that outcome. Those can be helpful for learning how people structure their time, for getting a glimpse into what a Viva is like, but I promise you, they cannot guarantee you an outcome simply by following what they did. Everyone's research is different. Everyone's daily lives are different and have different demands. But if one thing gets through to you from this discussion, I hope that while it's necessary to our well-being and sanity to hope for the best outcome, the best doesn't look the same for everyone. Several years ago, one of my nieces came up to me when I was joking about not doing a great job babysitting her and her sister, and said in a tiny 5-year-old voice, "Do your best. Your best is best for you." I thought she was a genius, but learned later she was repeating a line from her favorite show, Daniel Tiger. Turns out, even when you're no longer a child, those children's shows have some sage advice for people of all ages, because that quote is entirely accurate for PhDs when it comes to both our thesis and our Viva outcomes. Do your best is best for you. Best for me would not have been no corrections. My thesis would have been significantly poorer if not for the substantial corrections my examiners asked of me. I wouldn't have the confidence I do now discussing my work if I hadn't spent those extra months digging up a little deeper, polishing just a little more. It's easy to say when it's all done, but I'm grateful for those corrections, and I'm no longer ashamed that I didn't get to put no/minor corrections on that celebratory tweet. I am, however, still trying to get over crying in front of my examiner's part, but I'm doing my best, okay? Doing my best. Now that I don't have these two pictures on here to brag, but rather to show you the difference. The top photo was taken a few hours after my Viva. I hadn't cried by myself yet, and while I have a smile on my face, I'm not happy. Looking back at this, I can see the exhaustion in my eyes and the disappointment in myself. The bottom photo was taken after I received my PhD diploma. It's zoomed out, so you can't really tell, but trust me when I say that the year between these photos did wonders for that person, for me. Maybe I didn't finish when I expected to or get the outcome that I originally wanted, but I wasn't thinking of that in this last photo. So I just hope that when you all finally reach your Vivas, you remember that corrections are not glaring red marks telling you exactly what you did wrong. They're guidance on how to make sure you present this big, beautiful thing you've poured years of your life into in the best possible light. That take some time to cry if it doesn't go how you hoped, but remember that your worth in academia cannot be defined by whether you got no corrections or substantial corrections. And if you ever think that maybe it does for you, Remember that Dr. Danielle Schwertner got substantial corrections, and at the end of the day, still gets to call herself doctor.